Our headline story, Nigeria's automobile rejuvenation. Now, from the 60s to the mid-80s, Nigeria had a thriving automobile industry. The value chain was firmly established in production, locally created jobs, and by extension, wealth. But by the 90s, the economic realities of the high cost of production and the dwindling value of the naira changed things. The government has attempted to change the narrative a number of times in the past, and now a flicker of light is seen at the end of the tunnel. How bright is this light, and how committed are the private and public sectors to this? Stay tuned to find out. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. The National Automotive Design and Development Council said that there are 31 licensed producers of cars, trucks, and buses currently operating in Nigeria with a combined installed capacity of 205,000 vehicles a year, though far fewer numbers are produced due to huge funding, infrastructure, and capacity gaps. Industry analysts estimate that not more than 10,000 units have been produced each year since the launch of the NAIDP. In early 2019, the NADDC said only 9 of the assemblers were actually active. Therefore, in March of 2020, as a mark of relative success, the government commissioned $1 billion worth of locally assembled vehicles it said were made by 17 companies. In all, it appears the high import tariff regime aimed at discouraging imports and spurring local assembly has not achieved its purposes. Car imports, mainly used units, have continued to rise, an indication of the threat assemblers face. The NADDC adds that the country spends about $8 billion each year on imported vehicles. Although automobiles and related components are not on the central bank's list of 43 products ineligible for foreign exchange, the difficulty assemblers face obtaining foreign exchange has led to increased prices and reduced consumer demand. Corporate organizations, which are the largest buyers of new vehicles, have reduced or postponed purchases, thereby extending the replacement cycle of their fleets from 4 to 7 years. Smuggling, gray imports of second-hand vehicles, and the lack of reliable data make the exact size of Nigeria's vehicle markets and fleet size difficult to quantify. Challenges concerning the licensing and identification of vehicles further contribute to this difficulty. The country's current vehicle size is estimated to be about 11.7 million. Now joining me is Sunny Ganguly. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Cars45, and we'll be getting into this conversation right here on Business Edge. Sunny, thank you for joining us on Business Edge and welcome.
Thank you, Tolu. Thank you for having me this morning.
So as I said earlier in our intro, there is a bit of a background that we need to take cognizance of when we talk about the automobile industry in Nigeria. And it is now that we have a situation that work is being done to revive the industry. So from the middle of the 1970s to the end of the 1980s, through strategic partnerships, Nigeria housed vehicle manufacturing plants from the likes of Nissan, Peugeot, and even Volkswagen, as well as indigenous players like Anambra Motor Manufacturing Company Limited. So how did the country go from that situation to a situation where it is now used foreign cars that dominates the industry?
So I believe that the 3 major pillars of the automobile industry, which is steel or metal, plastics, and rubber, haven't developed. So that's on the hard side.
As separate,
these are the basic components needed.
Sectors.
Exactly.
Okay.
So unless you have 3 thriving industries in these sectors, it's difficult for the automobile industry to sit on top of that. Then you have the lack of technical human resources, mechanics or technical resources that are needed to drive this industry forward. So as those have gone down in quality, the assembling or the manufacturing sector has suffered.
Okay, so we've seen a layered level of conversation here. So you're saying with those 3 sectors, the plastic, the rubber, one other missing, that it's been difficult for the automobile sector to then build on any success. Correct. Because it lacks. All right, so as I said earlier, there are about 11.7 million estimated vehicles in Nigeria right now, the country's current vehicle population, that is. In 2019, passenger cars constituted the largest export item to Nigeria from the United States with an estimated cost of $667 million. And this is according to the U.S. Census Bureau. But beyond how much Nigerians are spending to import cars, what do you think this situation, as it constantly is constituted, is costing Nigeria?
I think it's costing it more than just the $667 million that you're sending out. because of the imports, we're not being able to develop the auto parts industry. We're not being able to develop the distribution chain. We're not being able to develop technical resources because there's no manufacturing. And car making today is mostly electronics and mechatronics. That has not developed either. So the whole value chain therefore gets affected. And when the car is imported, you often get two types of factors. One, of course, is the pull. Customers want imported vehicles. And there's the push for economic and environmental reasons from the US and Canada to push out old vehicles.
Yeah.
So what you're actually getting are polluting vehicles into the country, which are 2007, 2010, which have different pollution standards than what we really need today.
That's an interesting note that I want to quickly follow on that. So when you have a used car industry that is really thriving and you're taking in cars from everywhere, it's difficult to set standards, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So why is the situation, we have seen the Nigerian government many times try to have a cutoff mark, but that simply seems to not work. Why do you think that hasn't worked?
So I think the Nigerian government also looks at it from the sort of income perspective. So the older cars, which are often trucks and vans and commercial vehicles, are used by the poorer sections of society. So if you introduce a scrappage policy that takes them off the roads, the economically weaker section will suffer. So that's always been in the mind of the government. Then, of course, is the question of processing those scrap. Do we really have the kind of network or infrastructure to process, let's say, 2 million cars that come off the road? Where do they get processed? Where is the metal separate from the usable parts? So that becomes a serious challenge as well for the government to consider. But I think it's inevitable. We have to do something like that to make sure that the industry moves ahead as far as technology as well as pollution standards are concerned.
Very true. All right, so before we get into some of the latest moves that the government is making to boost the sector, let's also look at where the sector is in terms of the National Automotive Industry Development Plan, which was announced October 2013 and then it kicked off in July of 2014. The stated aim of the NAIDP was to stimulate investment in local vehicle production and keep revenue in Nigeria, keep money in country. Among others, it introduced a duty that took the vehicle import tariff to 70%. There was supposed to be the establishment of automotive test centers to make sure locally assembled vehicles met international requirements. It also meant to have a degree in automotive engineering offered at 3 Nigerian universities and mechanical training workshops in different cities. There was supposed to be a digital solution to check smuggling, as well as a vehicle financing scheme for Nigerians and licenses for 35 companies to assemble and produce the vehicles. Many of these things are not in place, Sonny. This is 2021. This was something that came about as of 2014. All these years down the line, has the plan even made any difference in the industry?
I don't think it's made any difference in the practical sense, honestly, because a lot of the government decision is happening in silos. So there has to be a lot more collaborative effort. Most of the duty changes are being driven by the CBN, to either protect the Naira. It's not being driven by the industry. So that is very important. It also has to be a skill development program as well as primary industry development program for an automotive policy to succeed. We've always seen that even the Nigerian consumer prefers a used Toyota, let's say, Toyota Corolla, as opposed to a locally manufactured vehicle. And tariffs is the way most industries around the world have grown, like Korea, China. Protectionism. It's a short-term shock, and when I say short-term, it could be 5 to 7 years, but it does allow the local industry to grow. Because a country like Nigeria has the market. We have 220 million people, of which 30 million people are potential consumers. The other big spur could be consumer finance. So everything from creditworthiness to credit scores need to be developed.
To collateral.
As collateral. And what we've seen in Nigeria is that we look at the borrower as the main person when we give them a car loan. We don't look at the asset. And I think that's where Cars45 plays a role, that we can actually define the asset, put a value to it, and therefore that becomes the underlying collateral for the loan, rather than the person taking the loan.
Okay, so some interesting points, and so we've talked about the loan financing, but you also talked about a gap that seems to be between what can be and what actually is. You have, like you said, a 23 million possible consumer base waiting for these cars, but they're not available. Then you also mentioned, of course, government leading, sort of CBN leading this charge in this, leaving behind the industry players. What kind of conversation has been had with the industry players in regards to what needs to be done for the industry?
I think the government, through different forum, and NADDC played a very important role, reached out to a lot of the automotive players. But at the end, when they announced the policy, neither the local assemblers nor the importers were happy. So just somewhere in between. I wish there was a lot more. I mean, you should take a stand, right? Do you want to protect and build a local car industry? Then that's a stand. Then other people will be unhappy for sure. Or you say, no, it's a free for all, free market, bring in whatever car you want, and these are the protections. Exactly. So if you don't take a stand one way or the other, you'll leave a lot of people unhappy. And therefore, whoever wants to then invest holds back his dollars. You know, they don't want to put up serious investment to build production facilities or testing facilities or technical resource development facilities, honestly.
All right, so we're going to take a break because there are still lingering issues that need to be solved as this plan approaches the 1 decade mark. And aside from challenges, what are the solutions? We have Nigeria's Finance Bill of 2021 that is seeking to add a bit of protection or a bit of solution to this automobile challenge in the industry. You're watching Business Edge. We'll be right back. You are watching Business Edge on News Central, and still with me is Sunny Ganguly. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Cars45, and we're looking at the automobile rejuvenation in Nigeria. Now, interestingly enough, we had mentioned that it seems it's the CBN, the Central Bank of Nigeria, that seems to be pushing a bit of some of the automotive challenges or changes in the industry. Now, listen to this. There's a new clause in Nigeria's Finance Bill for 2021 that will drive down import duties on foreign vehicles from 35% to 5%. This reduction in the import duty has resulted in a back and forth between investors, industry players, and government. The fear is that the proposed policy, as it could potentially limit the demand for locally produced vehicles. Now, in response, Nigeria's Vice President Yemi Osinbajo said that the decision was made to reduce the cost of vehicles and, by extension, cut down on the cost of transportation in Nigeria. Where is the meeting point? Where is the halfway mark? Where is the compromise in a situation like this? So, Sonny, let me put it to you. First of all, this reduction of import duties on foreign vehicles is inside the finance bill. Is that where you would expect to find information or to find at least some kind of movement regarding the automotive industry? Would you expect to find it in the finance bill?
We were surprised it came through the finance bill. Clearly shows that I think the CBN is pushing the monetary policy and fiscal imperatives before an automotive policy, which is fair from their perspective. But I think, as I said earlier, the finance bill has left both sides a little unhappy. I take the Vice President's point that it should ideally drive down the cost of transportation for the masses, for the average Nigerian. Yet it's unlikely to happen because you've driven down the cost of the capital product, which is the car, but your oil prices have gone up. Your road infrastructure is still not in place. So I think it's just a net off in the end. It will very unlikely help the local assembly sector, and it will very unlikely reduce the cost of transportation, to me, in practical reality.
So do you think there's no halfway point where the Vice President and the government can sort of get what they want, reducing the cost of transportation for the average Nigerian, and of course also, in a way, making sure assemblers can do what they do, but 35 to 5%, a whole 30% gone, which is something somebody would consider if they're bringing in a car that they want to purchase into Nigeria?
Of course, it will increase imports. There's no doubt about that. And we're seeing that already in the early parts of March. We saw a flush. However, I think the assemblers or the manufacturers will be unhappy and will hold back the investments they were planning to make. Simply because it's much cheaper now to land a 2012 used vehicle versus a new vehicle that's produced here, because the cost of power is high, the cost of land is high, infrastructure is not in place. So you're really not competing against the same type of end product that will come into the country. So I would doubt that the assemblers would be very happy with this.
So let's talk about the assemblers a bit. So Nigeria's annual vehicle demand stands at about 720,000. However, local production is put at about 14,000, making this a very enormous gap. And it's also very important because about 80% of trips in Nigeria are still by road. Nigeria is still a very road-centric country. So the demand and the need are there. So beyond some of the issues, whether it's the import duties that have made it more productive or attractive to bring in a foreign vehicle, used vehicle, than to purchase one locally, why has it seemed that assemblers and manufacturers, local ones in Nigeria, have not been able to meet the gap, even if we're saying 200,000 versus 14,000?
Correct. So Nigerians are very brand conscious, right? So I
feel like there's a different thing you wanted to say there.
No, I'll come to that. They are brand conscious, so they prefer Toyotas, Nissans, Hondas over local brands. So that's obviously been a challenge. And brand building requires a huge amount of investment, both from a marketing perspective as well as quality standards and product appeal in terms of design. So that has always been a challenge. And that's where protectionism plays a role. You have to incentivize people to buy locally, which is currently not there. The second thing is that no major global player is assembling locally, simply because they believe they bring the same standards of production and quality to every plant around the world. And the current manufacturing climate in Nigeria doesn't allow some of them to do that. And if they do it fully, the on-road price of that car will be 3 times what a used car or a local one will have. I think one way could be that government, state governments, federal governments and its agencies actually focus their buying, including senators and government officials, their buying on locally produced vehicles, which is how the US really developed, right? The government supported local industry. Here, governments are buying imported Lexus and Land Cruisers, and that becomes difficult, right? So you're not giving the local industry a chance to survive.
All right. No, you want to say something?
Yeah, so I just think even fleet owners, right, the large taxi companies, if they use locally used vehicles and those cars are doing the rounds of the cities, it kind of gives an incentive to the public also, or the individual, to say, okay, if my governor of the state is driving a locally produced car, even I should buy one. And that incentive is missing.
Incentive. So you talked about incentive, and I was getting now to the conversation about a bailout. Do you think the sector requires a bailout? In most terms, a sector that gets a bailout is a more well-established, firmly seated sector. So let's say maybe it's a handout or a hand up from the Nigerian government. What can the government do at this point in time that will help the automotive industry but won't hurt the consumer, who at the end of the day, truthfully, the average Nigerian has, with inflation, the value of the naira in their pockets has reduced.
Correct.
So getting a new car, getting a new locally assembled car is not what they're thinking of. So again, it comes back to a conversation about where's this meeting point? Where's the compromise in all of this so that we can get local assemblies going and we can make sure that our consumers are able to afford?
I think the government can have several tools in its handbox to help locally manufactured industry. If you introduce a scrappage policy, and one of the conditions of scrappage policy is that you get an incentive if you scrap your old vehicle, only if you buy a locally assembled vehicle. That could be one way. Fiscal incentives to local assemblers, including free land, taxes, tax breaks,
holidays
could help. Obviously, as I said, government itself is a big buyer in this country. If they would focus their buying on locally manufactured vehicles, that would help. I think another big incentive could be at least a temporary rise of tariffs for used cars, even if it's targeted to certain countries. The US really doesn't need your help, right, to be a good economy, so you can put a tariff barrier there. However, Turkey could be allowed to export, so you can play that game a little bit just to make sure that your local industry gets that 5-7 years to establish its foothold.
And it's interesting you say this, because this is a conversation we have about many industries in Nigeria, whether it's rice, whether it's materials, whether it's whatever. There's this idea that if government doesn't step in and sort of put a halt to what is coming in for at least 5 to 7 years, these industries will not grow.
Absolutely.
But that's government side. What about the industries themselves? What about the players themselves? Do they not have a responsibility? What can they do as well to help push forward their sector?
Yeah, so I may be controversial when I say this, but I think a lot of local assemblers have started at the wrong end of the vehicle chain. There are buses, trucks that they should focus on. That's sort of less sophisticated to make, and you probably have a price advantage because you're doing it locally. They're large units, difficult and expensive to import. But a lot of them have started with SUVs and pickups, which are sophisticated, highly evolved vehicles, which need a lot more technology to put in. And then you're up, competing against a Nissan Petrol or a Toyota Land Cruiser. But if you start at the basic level, could be armored trucks, could be delivery, freight type of vehicles. That gives you the volume then suddenly that can then be used to leverage up the sophistication chain in terms of technology. And India is a good example, both Tata and Ashok Leyland and Mahindras have built rugged vehicles that gave them the confidence and the financial resources then to move up the value chain.
And surprisingly, as you talked about India, I also wanted to touch base with them. They had some similar issues as well with their local automotive industry, and they've made a turnaround. And I think, just give me one other thing that you think Nigeria can learn from India.
I think consumer finance. The boom of India's automobile industry, especially passenger cars and motorcycles, happened because anybody literally, irrespective of their credit history, could actually buy a car. And that was fantastic. That just 10x the business. In the motorcycle segment, maybe 100x. And you'll see that in every streets in India, right? They're full of motorcycles and scooters. And I believe the same thing is going to happen in the electric mobility sector as well, because the banks will be allowed to give loans and the government will support it through small saving schemes.
Okay. So we've seen that there are others who faced these challenges before, but if we're serious, we could also learn a few lessons from them. A very big thank you to my guest, Sunny Ganguly. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Cars45. Thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge.
Thank you, Tolu. It's been a pleasure.
As we wrap things up, let's give you, of course, a few things you need to know, and that comes with NC4 to watch. And here it is with a few stories we are keeping our eyes on. So we have CAC, the importer and distributor of Volkswagen automobiles in Morocco, has secured exclusive import rights for seat vehicles into Morocco. Local media reports that the new deal came into effect on the 1st of April. On top of now owning the rights for seats, the CAC group also holds import and distribution rights in Morocco for Audi, Bentley, Porsche, Skoda, and Volkswagen. We move on to South Africa now, where the country is among the top 20 countries with a high presence of women, both ministers and parliamentarians, according to the World Economic Forum's 2021 Global Gender Gap Report. Now, with women occupying 15 of the 28 ministerial posts, the report ranks South Africa 10th in the percentage of women in parliament and 12th in the percentage of women in ministerial positions. Moving to the east now, Kenya Airways has announced 2 additional flights to the UK to beat the April 9th travel advisory. This is based on the ramped up short-term demand to the destination. The airline added the new flights on the 4th and 8th of April, which will allow travelers to enter the UK before the restrictions kick in. And finally, rounding things up right back in the West, Nigeria's external reserves maintained positive growth in the past 2 weeks, rising by $404 million to $34.820 billion as of March 31st. This is according to figures compiled from the Central Bank of Nigeria's website, which represents an increase of 1.2% compared with the $34.417 billion it stood as of March 18th. And that's it on this edition of Business Edge. As always, thank you so much for joining me. If you've missed any of our fantastic conversations on business and financial stories from across the continent, head to our website and also go to our YouTube channel, where you can, of course, find more. Until next time, I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun.